Hello. This presentation on the life of Oscar Wilde, illustrated through readings of his poetry, his prose work, and some poems about him by other authors, was originally presented live in November in Ipswich to a small audience as a fundraiser for the Albert Kennedy Trust, which looks after homeless youngsters who are part of the LGBT community. And if you enjoy listening to this presentation, perhaps you would also like to make a donation towards that charity, or indeed to whatever charity you think to be appropriate, something that Oscar might have approved of. So we'll look at the life of Oscar Wilde as we go along and pause quite regularly for readings from his poetry, from his prose work, from the poems of other people. Now, to begin at the beginning, Oscar was born on the 16th of October 1854, the middle of three children, to a highly educated, highly literate family, which gave him clearly quite significant advantages in life in terms of accessing education and a glorious library kept by his parents, who were very loving, doting parents who nurtured him well. His father was a surgeon and a passionate folklorist. His mother was a very accomplished poet who wrote under the pen name of Speranza, and she herself was also an even more accomplished folklorist than her husband was. And that passion for folklore not only presumably brought husband and wife together with shared hobbies, but it was also something that sparked a fascination and interest for mythology, for folklore, for magic, for mystery in their son Oscar. And quite a few other poems we'll read today, as well as plenty that we won't have time to read, but that Oscar wrote are redolent with Greek mythology, Roman mythology, Egyptian mythology, the folklore and traditions and magical ideas and practices of many different peoples from around the world. Now, having said he was the middle of three children, one of his siblings, his sister, very tragically died very young, and this had a huge impact on Oscar in all sorts of ways, including the writing of one of his early poems called Requiescat, which is a memorial poem for his departed sister. So, Requiescat. Tread lightly, she is near, under the snow. Speak gently, she can hear the daisies grow. All her bright golden hair tarnished with rust, she that was young and fair, fallen to dust. Lily-like, white as snow, she hardly knew she was a woman, so sweetly she grew. Coffin-board, heavy stone, lie on her breast. I vex my heart alone, she is at rest. Peace, peace, she cannot hear lyre or sonnet. All my life's buried here, heap earth upon it. Not only did it inspire that poem, but I think it's more than plausible to argue that the sense of grief he felt at seeing his sister die so young, on the verge of adulthood, on the verge of what might have been a full and engaging life, inspired in him a sense of the fleeting nature of life, the urgency of life, to engage in what we would call carpe diem, to seize every moment, to live life to the fullest, because, as he knew from direct experience, you never knew when it would end, when life would be snatched away from you. And of course you can see that both in him as a young man, excelling academically, reading vast quantities of literature, learning languages, travelling the world, wanting to explore and devour every intellectual experience, every emotional experience, and of course, as we, with the benefit of hindsight, know, pretty much every sexual experience as well. Perhaps all of that hunger, that craving for life, is a direct consequence of bereavement, a direct consequence of seeing a young life snuffed out through disease, through sudden loss. Now, having said I would read poems about Oscar, the next poem I'm going to read is not actually about Oscar at all. It's a poem by his mother under the pen name of Speranza. And I'm going to read this because it gives a flavour of her achievements, her gift with words, which clearly had a huge effect upon her son. And the kind of febrile intellectual atmosphere that he would have been growing up in, listening to his mother's poetic declamations, listening to his father's passion for research and study and learning and folklore and tradition, listening to all of the famous intellectuals of the day that came to visit the Wildes in their home, that young Oscar would have, well, either sat in on some of those events, I'm quite sure, or at least perhaps was sitting on the staircase listening to the adults talk and chat and taking in all of these ideas from these great intellects of the day. So this particular poem by his mother is called The Poet's Destiny, and I've chosen it out of her considerable body of work because it feels almost prophetic, as if perhaps she is writing about Oscar himself and his destiny. The priest of beauty, the anointed one, through the wide world passes the poet on. All that is noble by his word is crowned, but on his brow the acanthus wreath is bound. Eternal temples rise beneath his hand, while his own griefs are written in the sand. He plants the blooming gardens, trails the vine, but others wear the flowers, drink the wine. He plunges in the depths of life to seek rich joys for other hearts. His own may break, like the poor diver beneath Indian skies. He flings the pearl upon the shore and dies. Certainly that last line, indeed the last two words, particularly prophetic, and whilst I'm sure perhaps a little unlike the pearl diver, Oscar did significantly enjoy his own writings, both the plays, the stories, the poems, and of course financially benefited enormously from them and enjoyed the celebrity from them. Given how young he died in 1900, other people, audiences around the world, the readers of his stories, of his poems, the people attending the theatres to watch his plays or seeing the film versions of them or listening to the radio versions of them, millions of people around the world have greatly benefited from Wilde's works and efforts. And so, in a sense, he is a little bit like the pearl diver, casting his treasures onto the sand and then dying before he can fully benefit from them and leaving others to benefit from the beauties of what he's found and discovered. Off he went to school, private school, obviously, given the wealth of the family, and displayed his dazzling intellect from an exceedingly young age. He studied classics at Trinity College in Dublin, went on to study what is referred to was referred to as greats, the significant philosophers and intellects of the day, well, not just of the day, but of centuries past as well, and showed a dazzling gift for ancient Greek, for Latin, for all manner of dead languages, so much so that he came to assist one of his own tutors, Professor Mahaffy, in researching and writing a book called Social Life in Greece. Wilde helped with the translations. He had such an impressive gift for ancient languages, almost as if he were a native speaker of them, and if he happened to believe in reincarnation, well, who knows, perhaps he was at some point. He won a medal for Greek and eventually went on to leave Ireland and go to Oxford to study there at Magdalen College. And again, dazzled everyone with the accomplishments of his intellect. He was just such a brilliant, bright student, and met all sorts of significant people who would have a quite profound effect upon his life. the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, the ancient sources inspired him time and time again through both his poetry and his prose work. And so just a short poem, taking that Greek flavour to give you an idea of the sort of mindset he was experiencing with his passion, his devotion, his love for Greece itself. This is a poem called Hellas, which, just in case anyone is unfamiliar, is the Greek name for Greece. Hellas, the people of Greece are the Hellenes, the Hellenics. To drift with every passion till my soul is a stringed lute on which all winds can play. Is it for this that I have given away mine ancient wisdom and austere control? Methinks my life is a twice written scroll, scrawled over on some boyish holiday, with idle songs for pipe and virelay, which do but mar the secret of the whole. Surely that was a time I might have trod the sunlit heights, and from life's dissonance struck one clear chord to reach the ears of God. Is that time dead? Lo, with a little rod I did but touch the honey of romance, and must I lose a soul's inheritance? He was travelling around Europe as the wealthy did. Back then, and no doubt still do, although these days they probably travel far more widely afield than they did during the Victorian era, and was inspired by the architecture, the music, the culture, the lifestyle, both of modern Greece and of ancient Greece. The reference to a twice written scroll, palimpsest, is a manuscript often written on vellum, in which the original text is scrubbed out and then the parchment, the vellum, is reused for writing some other text on. But with modern day scientific techniques, the manuscript can be studied both to read whatever the second or third or fourth indeed set of writings were, but also to divine the imprint left by the original writings upon the scroll. So the twice written is both what was there to start with and which has then been rubbed out and new words put upon it. And perhaps he is thinking in terms of his soul having had an original wisdom written upon it, ancient wisdoms, which have been rubbed out, and the modern wisdoms of the 19th century written upon it instead. Maybe that has lost a lot, and I'm sure Oscar, with his not only his passions for intellectualism, but his love of male beauty and his desire for handsome young men, would have taken to heart the notion of the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, being a peoples, many of whom, although some of the modern day views of ancient Greece are a little bit overblown, but certainly many parts of ancient Greece were exceedingly tolerant and open to same-sex relationships, as long as they were conducted with a degree of discretion and a certain, what shall we say, power structure, for lack of a better word, between the two lovers, which reflected their social status and social hierarchy. And perhaps he was fully aware of that and mourning the loss of ancient customs which would have allowed him to live a much more open and fulfilled life than the Victorian moral strictures did. There are also certain words here that will crop up again and again in later poetic works, like virelay. Poets, authors of prose work too, often have what you might call written tics rather than verbal tics, in that certain phrases, certain words, certain adjectives reoccur frequently in their work. Clearly certain sounds capture the imagination of writers, and they come back to those terms again and again. And there are a couple of others that we'll touch on as we go along the readings as we go. Oscar was a deeply religious man, and that has to be emphasised because it's easy to sort of see the rather lascivious side of his life and focus on that, which doesn't sit terribly well with a Christian upbringing. And he has this odd dichotomy that runs through his soul, one foot in the camp of ancient paganism and one foot in the camp of Victorian Christianity, creating this difficult tension that constantly pulls at him, but also inspires him with all manner of poetic and prose ideas and concepts and understandings and philosophies of the world. One part of him yearns for the ancient sunlit heights and the ways of life back then, and the other part of him is firmly entrenched in the world of Victorian society, and his conviction in both God in the monotheistic Christian sense, but also the notion of ancient gods, which reoccurs throughout his work. The gods that call to his soul in a way that I think Max Weber would have understood the notion of gods as embodiments of values and ideals and concepts which the individual reverences and significantly values and embraces, as well as in the ancient polytheist sense of gods. Another poem now by his mother, still under the same pen name as Speranza. This is a section of a quite long poem. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it does go on for quite a while. But the poem is called To Ireland. And I'm choosing this one because his mother, his father were both passionate Irish people. Although obviously their son went off to study in England, in Oxford, they wanted his mother and father to see a significant revision to politics in Ireland, to the way the Irish people were treated by the English government, which they were outraged by, as indeed many people remained outraged by for many, many decades, and still are, frankly. Although obviously the English government is significantly better now towards Ireland than it was in the 1800s, when it was quite horrifically bad in its treatment of the Irish people. So I'm choosing this to emphasise the fact that Oscar Wilde grew up in a very passionately Irish environment, not just living in Ireland, but living in Irish politics, Irish nationalism, the urge for unity between the North and the South. And whilst he spent most of his life living in England as an adult, and obviously travelling to many other parts of the world as well, Ireland is at the core of him, and that's important to remember. To Ireland. My country, wounded to the heart, could I but flash along thy soul electric power to writhe apart the thunder clouds that roar round thee roll, and by my burning words uplift thy life from out death's icy drift, till the full splendours of our age shone round thee for thy heritage, as Miriam's by the Red Sea strand, clashing proud cymbals, so my hand would strike thy harp, loved Ireland. She flung her triumphs to the stars, in glorious chants for freedom won, while over Pharaoh's gilded cars the fierce death-bearing waves rolled on. I can but look in God's great face, and pray him for our fated race to come in Sinai thunders down, and with his mystic radiance crown some prophet leader with command to break the strength of Egypt's band and set thee free, loved Ireland. Some of this is inspired by the religious movement, spiritual movement that has dwindled down quite significantly. There's very little of it left these days. But there was a passion for what eventually became called the British Israelite movement. Those of you with a grounding in Christianity, or indeed who are practicing Christians, will be fully familiar with the 12 tribes of Israel. There's long been a tradition that's circulated around and around and around over the centuries of a 13th tribe of Israel. The Mormon movement is based upon the idea that there was indeed a 13th tribe of Israel, and that they got a trip, as it were, over to the Americas and founded a kind of proto-Christian society, of which the Mormon Church is the ultimate inheritor. Obviously, historically, that is pushing plausibility a little bit, but we'll leave that to one side. As well as the Mormon Church, which I suppose you could class them as American Israelites, there was the British Israelite movement, which made a very similar argument about there being a 13th tribe, but advanced the notion that that 13th tribe had marched across from the Middle East through Europe and ended up in ancient times in Britain, and that the ancient British and, by extension, the ancient Irish are descendants of that 13th tribe of Israel. And often the notion that the Druids were envisioned as looking very much like the biblical patriarchs in the illustrated Bibles that were hugely popular in the Victorian era. Old men, long white beards, flowing caftans. Certainly when the revivalist movement came to start holding ceremonies, Druidic ceremonies, at Stonehenge and Avebury and various other places, the Victorian revivalists often adopted that sort of visual look of long flowing white caftans and old men with big white beards, feeling that they were akin with the biblical patriarchs, and it led to this notion that was very popular in the 1700s and the 1800s, that the Druids were sun worshippers, S-U-N, the sun in the sky, but the sun in the sky was a sort of metaphor for the idea of a kind of a proto-version of Christ. And that when the Christian missionaries arrived in Britain and in Ireland, there were no martyrdoms caused by the native tribes. The only martyrdoms that took place were inflicted by the Romans during the Roman occupation, and by other later peoples like the Norsemen and so on when they settled in parts of the country. But the actual native British, the native Irish, did not martyr any of the Christian missionaries. Now that doesn't mean they welcomed them with open arms. I'm sure, like many a missionary, be they Mormon or Jehovah's Witness or whatever else, who go knocking on people's doors, often get told to go forth and multiply and have the door slammed in their face. And I'm sure quite a few missionaries probably had that experience in ancient Britain and ancient Ireland. But none of them were actually killed, to the point where indeed there was a bishop who wrote a letter of complaint, bewailing the fact that there were so few martyrs, with the argument that the blood of martyrdom sowed the seeds of faith, and if these native peoples couldn't sort of work up the bloodthirsty urge to go and slit the throats of a few missionaries, then how on earth were they meant to spread the faith without a bit of martyr's blood to sow the ground first? Others took a more positive approach to that, so the British Israelite movement believed that one of the reasons why there were no martyrdoms committed by the native British or the native Irish was that when they heard the early Christian gospel being preached to them, they found it was almost identical to what they believed anyway, because they were descended from the 13th tribe of Israel. And so some of that imagery, some of that belief, I'm not suggesting for a minute that Lady Wilde was a member of the British Israelite movement, only that these ideas were very widespread and disseminated through the more educated classes of Britain and of Ireland, and that a lot of people, shall we say, wanted to think that their ancestry could be tracked back, even by very convoluted and implausible journeys, to the revered people of biblical times. And so this idea of there being a prophetic leader to lead the Irish from the tyranny of Egypt, in other words, the tyranny of government in London, with the Prime Minister, possibly Queen Victoria as well, but more likely the Prime Minister of the day being envisioned rather like Pharaoh, dominating the Hebrew slaves in ancient Egypt. And weaving into that native Celtic imagery, like the striking of the harp. So a lot of these concepts weave in and out of each other. So returning to this idea that Oscar had a foot in two camps, a faith in Christianity and a faith in paganism. We'll look at the faith in Christianity first. He was raised in the Church of Ireland, but for the whole of his life, from middle childhood on to his death, he had a fascination, a passion for Catholicism as well. For the bells, the smells, the rituals, the ceremonies, the whole theatre of Catholicism and the ideologies, the key teachings and concepts of Catholicism. He never formally, officially converted. He remained a member of the Church of Ireland. He remained a Protestant, but was constantly dancing around the edge of Catholicism. The stained glass there is obviously a little bit ironic, the notion of Saint Oscar, which wouldn't go down too well in some circles, but there we go. So this particular poem I want to read to you is a short one. It was written by him whilst he was in Florence. It's called Ave Maria Gratia Plena and is inspired by some of the religious scenes he witnessed whilst travelling through Florence in Italy. Was this his coming? I had hoped to see a scene of wondrous glory, as was told of some great god who in a rain of gold broke open bars and fell on Danae, or a dread vision as when Semele, sickening for love and unappeased desire, prayed to see God's clear body, and the fire caught her brown limbs and slew her utterly. With such glad dreams I sought this holy place, and now with wondering eyes and heart I stand before this supreme mystery of love. Some kneeling girl with passionless, pale face, an angel with a lily in his hand, and over both the white wings of a dove. I particularly like this one because it weaves together classical Greek imagery with Catholic imagery, with the stained glass windows and the statues and so on that he's seeing dotted around Florence, as well as people in acts of worship. The notion of Semele praying to see the divine, and that infused with the Greek notion that if you ever actually do see the divine in its raw form, then you're incinerated, you're just blown away, you are not even metaphorically incinerated, you are quite literally reduced to a pile of ashes, because the human mind, the human body cannot cope with the unadulterated presence of holiness. All it can cope with is divinity in disguise, which is why the Greek myths, and also arguably many other myths from other parts of the world, are filled with stories in which the gods disguise themselves as beggars or as travellers or as animals or a variety of other different things, and then make themselves known to people. It's only when they're disguised as something earthly that we can cope with them. And you could make an argument that that is one of the reasons why so many religions from around the world make extensive use of statuary and imagery, whilst some of the more radical Puritan movements have apoplexy and see this as idolatry and the worship of images, to those traditions, those religious practices that do have the images in the first place, they're not really worshipping the carved statue, the stained glass, the painted icon. They are worshipping what it represents. They are looking upon this piece of stone, this set of coloured glass panels, or a painted canvas, or whatever it might be made of, and understanding that this is an approachable face of something ineffable, something beyond human conception, beyond the human capacity to perceive. And whilst within Christianity they're not arguing that people are going to be reduced to a pile of ashes, there are many religions, not just the Greeks, who would say if you saw the divine as it is, you would be reduced to a gibbering idiot. Your mind just wouldn't cope. It would snap under the sheer force of it. It would be a little bit like sticking your fingers into a plug socket, and the current would just sort of burn you away. Therefore, you need to have an intermediary, and the intermediary could be the statue, the stained glass, the painted icon, whatever it might be. Something that you can look upon and focus your mind upon, because as humans we are very visual creatures and we like to be able to look at something rather than talk to thin air. That thing to cast your eyes upon is a safety method, in a sense. It's something to keep you safe. It gives you the focus you need without leaving you vulnerable to the unadulterated power of the divine. And for some people that might be reciting words, listening to poetry, to prayers, as well as looking at things. It may be listening to things that are themselves intermediaries. And that's what he's craving in that poem. He wants to have that experience, but knows it might dissolve him, it might overwhelm him, it might burn him away. The next one is just called Sonnet, and it was written in Holy Week whilst he was travelling through Genoa. I wandered through Scoglietti's far retreat. The oranges on each hanging spray burned as bright lamps of gold to shame the day. Some startled bird with fluttering wings and fleet made snow of all the blossoms at my feet. Like silver moons the pale narcissi lay, and the curved waves that streaked the great green bay laughed i' the sun, and life seemed very sweet. Outside the young boy priest passed, singing clear, Jesus, the son of Mary, has been slain. Oh, come and fill his sepulchre with flowers. Oh God, those dear Hellenic hours had drowned all memory of thy bitter pain. The cross, the crown, the soldiers, and the spear. Again, although he is in Genoa, he's talking about Hellenic hours, the time he is immersed in himself in the classical world, both the classical world of Rome and the classical world of Greece, of the Hellenes. And the beauty, the romance, the charm, all the things he values about the ancient classical world. Sometimes, he's arguing, in the last couple of lines of this sonnet, are glossing over, unaware, drawing a veil across the tragedy that is at the heart of Christianity, in both its Catholic and its Protestant manifestations. The sacrifice on the cross, the death, the crown of thorns, the brutality of Longinus thrusting his spear into Christ's side. All of the beauties of the handsome men and beautiful women, the statues of ancient Greece, the statues of ancient Rome that he's been lost in, he's been dreaming about, are, in a sense, almost too beautiful, too distracting, too perfected. It doesn't have the gore, for lack of a better word, at its heart. And suddenly there he is in Holy Week, listening to this young boy priest singing, and it hits him like a sledgehammer that the core message of Christianity is that Christ died, and died brutally, not a sort of genteel fainting on the couch like some Victorian maiden with her stays on too tight. Not a swooning death, but a gory, bloody, horrible, violent, nasty, torturous death. Because being crucified is agonising. It's a horrific way to die. It's not like some Agatha Christie where half a sip of a cup of cyanide and they're dead within seconds, and it looks all very genteel on stage or on television. It's agony, and suddenly he's slapped in the face by the agony, not just at the heart, I think, of Christianity, but the agony that is part of life, everywhere, no matter what religion or lack of religion is to be found. It's there. It cannot be looked beyond. Oh, and I should mention, before I go on to the next poem, that the building there, I've already talked about that stained glass imagery, but the building there is the church that Oscar went to as a child. And it still stands to this very day. It's not the most picturesque of buildings, I think you'll agree. It's a rather functional structure, and perhaps that helps to explain some of his fascination for Catholicism, because Catholic churches with the stained glass and the statuary on the inside and the gargoyles on the outside, the Catholic churches tend to be very beautiful, very ornate, very artistically fascinating, and would doubtless appeal to the soul of someone so in love with the visual, so in love with the beautiful, the ornate, the baroque. So perhaps having grown up with something really quite visually basic, then he felt the yearning for something fancier. This next poem, E Tenebris, from the shadows, from the darkness, again celebrates Christian imagery. Come down, O Christ, and help me. Reach thy hand, for I am drowning in a stormier sea than Simon on the lake of Galilee. The wine of life is spilt upon the sand. My heart is as some famine murdered land, whence all good things have perished utterly. And well I know my soul in hell must lie, if I this night before God's throne could stand. He sleeps perchance, or rideth to the chase, like Baal when his prophets howled that name from morn to noon on Carmel's smitten height. Nay, peace I shall behold before the night, the feet of brass, the robe more white than flame, the wounded hands, the weary human face. The swinging between extremes, between rapture for things beautiful and despairing that he's drowning in a sea, his heart is a famine murdered land. Sometimes I wonder if he suffered from what we would now call manic depression or bipolar disorder, swinging between extremes. Possibly that's projecting too much of a modern take onto an earlier period, and an individual who's obviously no longer alive to argue one way or the other. But a lot of his poetry does seem to either be very heightened or plunging into the depths. So that does make me wonder, what is it going on in his heart when he was writing this poem that he felt like a famine-murdered land? Again, easy to project backwards and think that perhaps it was guilt, that some days he would indulge his sexual appetites and feel wonderful and terrific, and other days he would be filled with a latent Christian guilt that he was doing something terrible, wicked and sinful, and being torn back and forth between his more pagan side and his more Christian side. And there may, of course, be way more to it than just sex. There may be all sorts of other things going on as well, that he was being torn about and feeling that some days he was in the ecstasies of art and beauty and poetry, and other days it was all shallow and empty and dry as dust and meaningless. And where was he going in life? What was he doing? Was he achieving anything meaningful? Swinging back and forth between these extremes. I like the end element as well, the return to this Christian notion of Christ with a weary human face. Having read that earlier poem of the divine burning away humanity by its too potent force, where Christianity adds something and gives a layer not necessarily prevalent within Judaism. Judaism, God is clearly a very powerful, fiery, vigorous force. Christ is the human face that comes in, and it's the face of suffering. We're back to this idea of the crown of thorns, the spear in the side. It's a human face that knows what it is to have wounded hands, to be weary, to be tired, to carry the burden of humanity, and that obviously is the underlying message, or one of the underlying messages at any rate, of Christianity. And I think, despite his wealth, his fame, his pretense of being very superficial, very vacuous, and this kind of, maybe vacuous is too cruel a word, but when he's on stage, when he's performing to friends at parties, he comes across as terribly flippant, terribly glib. But I think underlying all of that was a man with a very deep understanding of life, of poverty, of suffering, of anxiety, that he saw not only the miseries in his own life, but was acutely conscious of the miseries in other people's lives. To the point where he went on to write a work called The Soul of Man Under Socialism. His idea of socialism is not necessarily the same as everybody else's idea of socialism, in that within Wilde's vision of socialism, there would be the abolition of wealth and private property, which is a key argument within most variations of socialism. But that rather than it being a kind of cloth cap and whippet view of socialism, it's one in which the artist, the poet, the intellectual is indulged and provided for, in which the labours of the mind, the labours of the creative muse, are valued as much as the labours of the manual worker. Historically, when Wilde was writing, socialism was being discussed as an idea, but not really put into practice very much, aside from small communes and things like that. Into the 20th century, we get to see socialism and Marxism and communism being put into practice, and it's never as glorious as Oscar Wilde imagines. Quite the opposite, in fact, is quite horrific. Karl Marx himself regarded socialism as a stepping stone on the route to communism. So you have socialism for a while, get people used to it, and then you ditch it and replace it with communism. And true communism, he felt, could only come about with basically massacring anyone who stood against it. He was very much in favour of bloodshed and violence, a very militant man, and I'm sure Oscar Wilde would not have been. Now, I'm not going to read great big chunks of The Soul of Man Under Socialism, because it's tad dry, but I'll give you examples of a few paragraphs here and there, selected to illustrate points. So the first one: with the abolition of private property, then, we shall have true, beautiful, healthy individualism. Nobody will waste his life in accumulating things and the symbols of things. One will live. To live is the rarest thing in the world. Most people exist, that is all. And this is perhaps a view of socialism that I suspect quite a few students have, at least for a while. Often they don't have it for very long, but for a while. The idea of abolishing private property, that you're not going to have people with billions and billions and billions in the bank and other people with sixpence, but that there will be collective ownership of all of the houses, the cars, the clothes, the food, the books, the furniture, everything else that might exist and people might want, and that some centralised administrative body, the people, which invariably turns out to be the government, but never mind, will distribute these goodies to people as they are needed. And of course, when people have them, they don't really have them at all within this concept of socialism, because there is no private property. What you have is the loan of a set of clothes, the loan of a car, the loan of a house, the loan of a table and chairs, and whatever else you might be going for. And the collective can require that loan back at any time. For Wilde, who clearly had never ever experienced socialism in any real world sense, for him it was just an idea, not something he had any lived direct personal experience of. Not having to spend your life working your backside off to acquire goodies would free people up to do more meaningful things, as he says, to live in some kind of artistic, inspirational sense, rather than merely drudging from day to day to day. And given the levels of squalor and poverty and people working until their bodies collapsed under them and they died, which went on in the Victorian age, still to a point goes on in Britain these days, in some parts of Britain anyway, but can certainly be seen in other parts of the world where sweatshop labour is permitted, if not indeed actively encouraged, by governments, and you do have crushing levels of poverty and people working until they die of exhaustion and illnesses and injuries occurred in the workplace. This is a very understandable reaction against that sort of thing, and whilst I don't think Oscar Wilde ever did a day's manual labour in his life, he certainly socialised with people who lived in either directly in poverty or had at least grown up in poverty and were scrabbling their way out of it by doing whatever they had to do. Thinking here chiefly of a lot of the rent boys he would have socialised with. So he would have had experience, he would have seen the rookeries in London, he would have seen poverty and squalor on his travels around the world, and seen people working themselves to exhaustion just to have the most minimal level of existence for themselves and their children, and rebelled against it. So this is, I want to suggest, a form of faith for Oscar, as much as his Christianity. This is a sort of a politicised form of faith, a belief in something he had no concrete lived experience of, but as a set of ideals, a set of principles, of guidelines of how he envisioned not only his own life one day being, but everybody else's lives as well. And with in the last few years, there's been an upsurge of interest in slavery. Sadly, it seems to be an upsurge of interest in historical slavery rather than contemporary slavery. And it's always worth bearing in mind that there are, according to various charities, there are now more people in slavery in the world today in 2023 than there were in the 1700s. And yet we seem to get much more excited about tearing down statues of people who've been dead for centuries than we do in addressing the slavery of people who are alive at the moment. And possibly, just to be a little bit cynical, one of the reasons why we don't get terribly excited about the people who are living in slavery right this minute is because we're wearing the clothing and utilising the mobile phones and the laptops and what have you, which their slavery makes possible. Digging up the cobalt to go in phones and electric car batteries, and wearing clothes made by 10-year-olds in sweatshops. Much more easy to shriek and holler about the slavery of the long dead than the slavery of the still living that we benefit from. But there we go, that's just me being bitter and vindictive. So a quote from him about slavery. Just as the worst slave owners were those who were kind to their slaves, and so prevented the horror of the system being realised by those who suffered from it, and understood by those who contemplated it, so, in the present state of things in England, the people who do most harm are the people who try to do most good. So in that last part, I think is just quite apposite. A lot of people who try their best to do good in the world often end up causing a damn sight more problems than they resolve. If he'd lived long enough to see the internet develop, not only would it be incredibly old, but he would have, I'm sure, had something very pithy to say about all the people who seem to spend their life on the internet trying to do what they imagine to be good and causing no end of misery and grief in the process. It's an ambiguous one, isn't it? This notion that where there is a corrupt system, the people who tried to organise it in the least corrupt, least awful, kindest, for lack of a better word, way possible, may be inadvertently perpetuating the system, rather than the sheer horror of it being known and then that causing the system to collapse or be ripped apart. What he wants, of course, is an end to not only, well, slavery had ended, officially, legally ended in his lifetime. It was a done deal. But the what he's talking about really is much the idea of the anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, who argued for the term, coined the term wage slavery, suggesting that the people toiling in factories and down coal mines and various other grotty manual labour jobs back during the Victorian era were technically not slaves, were technically paid a wage and technically free, but he was essentially suggesting that there was only a fag paper's worth of difference between a slave and a so-called free manual worker, in that if those manual workers ever did try to walk out their jobs and go somewhere else, they'd often not be given a reference that would be held over their heads, and without a good reference a person would be struggling to get any job anywhere and would often end up in the most squalid of poverty and turning to crime and losing the roof over their head and the food on their table because they'd tried to better their life by walking out away from a bad employer and trying to find a better one. So that there were many employers who would totally abuse their power, their control, both in the sense of paying dismal wages, physically assaulting staff, sexually assaulting staff, I'm sure as well, doing all sorts of god-awful, horrible things to their employees, like the owners of the Bryant and May matchmaking factory, who chose to use a form of phosphorus that caused the women who worked in the factories making the matches to develop a horrific illness called fozzie jaw, as the phosphorus ate away the bones in their jaw, leaving them in screaming agony with a condition for which there was no medical treatment at all at that time. The reason they did this was because the dangerous type of phosphorus was cheaper than the safer type of phosphorus, and in order to save a bit of money they effectively condemned the women who worked in those factories to die the most god-awful, appalling deaths. Doubly awful when you bear in mind that Bryant and May were Quakers. Quakers usually are at the absolute forefront of defending the rights of the oppressed and the downtrodden. But I suppose in every religion there are people who pay lip service and don't necessarily follow through on what they preach. But there we go. A slight prophetic element, with a very short one-sentence quote. On mechanical slavery, on the slavery of the machine, the future of the world depends. During Wilde's lifetime, machinery within factories, to an extent within the home, was starting to flourish and being developed. He was at the tail end of the Industrial Revolution, and so the use of mechanical devices, this obviously before the notion of robots as such, but mechanical devices to do the laborious jobs that human beings were paid to do. He saw that as actually a positive thing, that one day it would free people from having to do these awful, back-breaking manual jobs, that there would be machines to do it for them. And instead of humans being oppressed and driven into this kind of work, machines would be the new slaves, as it were, to do the back-breaking work, which obviously has to quite a large extent become a reality for people in the 20th and 21st centuries, where machines do more and more things. Whether that does always liberate people to live happier lives, or sometimes, quite often perhaps, results in people just being unemployed and cast aside and treated as irrelevant, well, that's another question entirely, and not one that Oscar particularly addressed. Returning, for the last two quotes, to the world of the ancients, the world of the Greeks. Know thyself was written over the portal of the antique world. Over the portal of the new world, be thyself shall be written. And that certainly, I think, is extremely prophetic when we think about the modern day identity politics movement of individuals who not only want the freedom to be who they are, perfectly understandable that, but also want the support, approval, encouragement, the celebration of others in their being of themselves. So it's no longer a case of be yourself quietly in a corner somewhere over there, just get on with it. It's now the insistence that everybody else has to wave a flag and celebrate it too. So that's, yes, definitely perhaps written over the portal of the new world, be thyself. I think he was on to something there. And the last one, quote, the new individualism is the new Hellenism. So the ancient world of multiple gods and goddesses is replaced by a new world of individualism where everyone is a god or a goddess. At least that's perhaps how he saw things going. And again, a little bit prophetic there. Certainly the latter half of the 20th century and still very much in the 21st century, the sense of autolatry, self-worship, self-adulation, the wish to be master or mistress of your own destiny and to be revered, treasured, valued, worshipped, you might say, does seem to be quite prevalent, it has to be said. Now, just before we get on to the Greeks, in the world of theatre, Oscar obviously came to a huge amount of prominence, not only his poetry and his prose writings, but his stage plays and productions throughout the 1880s flourished in all sorts of ways and inspired numerous films and amdram versions and television productions in due course and radio productions and all sorts of other things. The theatre was where, in many respects, he came to absolute prominence. This was also the period when he was writing his novels as well, both his children's stories and his undoubtedly most famous work about Dorian Gray. He achieved considerable fame, considerable prominence. So a poem here, a short one. He wrote several short poems inspired by his work in the theatre, his meeting with actors and actresses, many of whom became lifelong friends for him, great supporters for him, as he entered the world of theatre, and it became this whole new experience, this whole new opportunity to flourish, to perform, to polish up his aphorisms and almost become a caricature of himself physically on the stage, but also performing at parties after play production parties and so on, which continued the notion of a performance, as well as his giving public readings of his poetry, of his prose works. So this particular one is dedicated to Henry Irving. Henry Irving was, for anyone unfamiliar, a very famous actor-manager of the day. the sort of person that Laurence Olivier was very much in the model of. The silent room, the heavy creeping shade, the dead that travel fast, the opening door, the murdered brother rising through the floor, the ghost's white fingers on thy shoulders laid, and then the lonely jewel in the glade, the swords broken, the stifled scream, the gore, the grand revengeful eyes when all is o'er. These things are well enough. But thou wert made for more august creation. Frenzied Lear should at thy bidding wander on the heath, with the shrill fall to mock him. Romeo for thee should lure his love and desperate fear, pluck Richard's recreant dagger from its sheath. Thou trumpet set for Shakespeare's lips to blow. A little bit of an upbraiding, I suppose. One of Henry Irving's big productions was Dracula, based upon the book by Bram Stoker, and incidentally, Oscar Wilde had once dated the woman who went on to eventually marry Bram Stoker. And whilst he is saying in that poem there that the rising of the dead and so on, all of the theatricals of Dracula are all well and good and entertaining to watch, nonetheless, he's giving a little bit of an upbraiding to Henry Irving that he ought to be focusing on the classics, on Shakespeare and other grand works, rather than slumming it, I suppose, as Oscar saw, in what he might have thought of as a bit of a pot boiler. So it's just a few words from him there about what he felt was good quality theatre and what he felt was maybe a bit of old nonsense, entertaining and money-making for the troops. And of course, Oscar would have known all about the need to make money, but not necessarily high art. Now, I'd like to give you now not a poem, but one of his short stories, one written for children. This is called The Doer of Good, and it's prose, but it does have the feel of a poem about it. It's got this rather magical, fluid, dream-like state about it. And I do suspect that probably the team of Monty Python, I can't remember off the top of my head which one of them actually wrote the script for Life of Brian, but I suspect they were aware of The Doer of Good before they wrote it. It was night time, and he was alone. And he saw afar off the walls of a round city and went towards the city. And when he came near, he heard within the city the tread of the feet of joy, and the laughter of the mouth of gladness, and the loud noise of many lutes. And he knocked at the gate, and certain of the gatekeepers opened to him. And he beheld a house that was of marble, and had fair pillars of marble before it. The pillars were hung with garlands, and within and without there were torches of cedar, and he entered the house. And when he had passed through the hall of Chalcedony and the hall of Jasper, and reached the long hall of feasting, he saw lying on a couch of sea purple one whose hair was crowned with red roses, and whose lips were red with wine. And he went behind him, and touched him on the shoulder, and said to him, "Why do you live like this?" And the young man turned round and recognised him, and made answer and said, "But I was a leper once, and you healed me. How else should I live?" And he passed out of the house and went again into the street. And after a little while he saw one whose face and raiment were painted, and whose feet were shod with pearls, and behind her came slowly as a hunter a young man, who wore a cloak of 2 colours. Now the face of the woman was as the fair face of an idol, and the eyes of the young man were bright with lust. And he followed swiftly and touched the hand of the young man and said to him, "Why do you look at this woman in such wise?" And the young man turned round and recognised him and said, "But I was blind once, and you gave me sight. What else should I look?" And he ran forward and touched the painted raiment of the woman, and said to her, "Is there no other way in which to walk save the way of sin?" And the woman turned round and recognised him, and laughed and said, "But you forgave me my sins, and the way is a pleasant way." And he passed out of the city. And when he had passed out of the city, he saw seated by the roadside a young man who was weeping. And he went towards him and touched the long locks of his hair and said to him, "Why are you weeping?" And the young man looked up and recognised him and made answer, "But I was dead once, and you raised me from the dead. What else should I do but weep?" I think for anyone who's ever worked in any kind of social care, there will be a lot of sympathising there. The feeling of helping people and trying to get their lives back together and help them get back on track. And then sometimes realising what they do with their life when it's back on track, and you end up shaking your head and wondering why you bothered. I also wonder if there's a little bit of self-reflection going on there. The living of the life of sin, the look of lust. Wondering if he's really using his time, his skills, his abilities, his opportunities to the best advantage, but going back and going back to it time and time again. Now, of the Greeks themselves, having said he had one foot in Christianity, his other foot, I think, was planted very definitely, very decidedly in the ancient realm, in the pagan realm. He wrote numerous poems, made numerous references in his plays and his prose work to the Greeks, to the Romans, to the myths, the stories, the whole realm. And of course he wasn't the only one. Numerous people, both in the 19th and 20th century, and obviously still in the 21st, great thinkers, classicists, were inspired by the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, the stories of the distant past. Author after author, thinker after thinker, philosophers, economists, psychologists, theorists of every shape and size and form, from Freud onwards, have drawn on the muse of the ancient world and the insights that the ancient world has to offer to the modern world, the timelessness of the stories. So this one, which is a poem dedicated to the story of Endymion. There is a note saying it is for music, but I'm unaware of there being any actual musical notation for it, so quite what the tune should be, I really don't know, which is perhaps a relief for you, because I have the singing abilities of a cat falling down a mine shaft. So I won't even pretend to sing this, I will just read it. Endymion. The apple trees are hung with gold, and birds are loud in Arcady. The sheep lie bleating in the fold, the wild goat runs across the wold. But yesterday his love he told, I know he will come back to me. O rising moon, O lady moon, be you my lover's sentinel. You cannot choose but know him well, for he is shod with purple shoon. You cannot choose but know my love, for he a shepherd's crook doth bear, and he is soft as any dove, and brown and curly is his hair. The turtle now has ceased to call, upon her crimson-footed groom the grey wolf prowls about the stall. The lilies singing seneschal sleeps in the lily bell, and all the violet hills are lost in gloom. O risen moon, O holy moon, stand on the top of Hellis, and if my own true love you see, oh, if you see the purple shoon, the hazel crook, the lad's brown hair, the goat skin wrapped about his arm, tell him that I am waiting where the rushlight glimmers in the farm. The falling dew is cold and chill, and no bird sings in Arcady. The little fawns have left the hill. Even the tired daffodil has closed its gilded doors, and still my lover comes not back to me. False moon! False moon, O waning moon! Where is my own true lover gone? Where are the lips vermilion, the shepherd's crook, the purple shoon? Why spread that silver pavilion? Why wear that veil of drifting mist? Oh, thou hast young Endymion, thou hast the lips that should be kissed. It is perhaps easy to imagine that, although this is meant to be a woman pleading for her lost love, the handsome shepherd boy, to come back to her, that perhaps this is also Oscar himself mourning over some pretty boy who hasn't come back, someone he's dreamed about, someone he's yearned for, who is gone from him, who's simply not there anymore. Although that may just be me projecting rather more into the reading than is justified by it, but I think that is a poem of personal yearning, of feeling bereft and lost for someone who's gone and not come back. Now this next one is devoted not to Endymion and shepherd boys, although it kind of is after a fashion. He obviously likes shepherd boys. It's devoted to the great god Pan, the goat-foot god Pan. Pan is a deity who fascinates me. He keeps cropping up in literature, in poetry, in arts, in music, in dreams. A god I come back to again and again and again. And this is a poem like the Endymion one that starts on a note of joy, sort of, but gets sadder as it goes on. And maybe there's an element of that in Oscar's life generally, starting on a high note with all of those academic achievements, the dazzling promise of a future career, the great theatrical performances and best-selling books, but getting sadder and sadder and sadder as it went on. Pan. Oh, goat-foot god of Arcady, this modern world is grey and old, and what remains to us of thee? No more the shepherd lads in glee throw apples at thy wattled fold, O goat-foot god of Arcady. Nor through the laurels can one see thy soft brown limbs, thy beard of gold, and what remains to us of thee? And dull and dead our Thames would be, for here the winds are chill and cold. Oh, goat-foot god of Arcady. Then keep the tomb of Hellis, thine olive woods, thy vine-clad wold, and what remains to us of thee? Though many an unsung elegy sleeps in the reeds our rivers hold. O goat-foot god of Arcady, oh, what remains to us of thee? Leave the hills of Arcady, thy satires and thy wanton play. This modern world has need of thee. No nymph or faun indeed have we, for faun and nymph are old and grey. Oh, leave the hills of Arcady. This is the land where liberty lit grave, browed Milton on his way. This modern world hath need of thee. A land of ancient chivalry where gentle Sidney saw the day. Oh, leave the hills of Arcady. This fierce sea lion of the sea, this England lacks some stronger they. This modern world hath need of thee. Then blow some trumpet loud and free, and give thine oaten pipes away. Oh, leave the hills of Arcady. This modern world hath need of thee. Like a great many writers of children's stories in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries, there is a significant yearning, a feeling that the modern world is bereft of something that the ancient world had, something intimately connecting magic and nature and fantasy and yearning and desire and freedom. Something gone and lost amidst those grey satanic mills, amidst the darkness and the grime and the filth of the cities. And yes, you could certainly say that it is a romantic eulogisation of the countryside, which was, for most people living in it, a place of great hardship and back-breaking toil in all weathers. Maybe if you're sitting in a nice, well-heated, upmarket house in an expensive area of London, then the countryside can seem very sort of picturesque by comparison. But despite the eulogising of a way of life that most of the poets and authors had not very much personal experience of, at least not the manual side of it at any rate, I think there is nonetheless a genuine sentiment, a genuine understanding and an insight that the world of the, in this case, 19th century had lost something wondrous and magical and passionate, and something at heart mythological, something that leapt between the worlds of man and the worlds of beasts, between the worlds of forests and fields and seashores and caves and the world of the cities and the towns, between the world of freedom and music and laughter and passion and joy and desire and the worlds of probity and respectability and hard work and industry and uptight, morally upstanding living. A difficult world to dance between, but he danced between it nonetheless. Having given you two Greek poems, I'd now like to give you a section of quite a long poem which draws upon Egyptian imagery, and it's not technically about ancient Egypt, as you'll see as we go along, but it does make extensive use of the imagery of ancient Egypt, just to show that it was more than the Greeks and the Romans that inspired Oscar. This poem is called The Sphinx. In a dim corner of my room, for longer than my fancy thinks, a beautiful and silent sphinx has watched me through the shifting gloom. Inviolate and immobile, she does not rise, she does not stir, for silver moons are naught to her, and naught to her the suns that reel. Red follows grey across the air, the waves of moonlight ebb and flow. But with the dawn she does not go, and in the night time she is there. Dawn follows dawn, and nights grow old, and all the while this curious cat lies crouching on the Chinese mat, with eyes of satin rimmed with gold. Upon the mat she lies, and leers on the tawny throat of her flutters the soft and silky fur, or ripples to her pointed ears. Come forth, my lovely seneschal, so somnolent, so statuesque. Come forth, you exquisite grotesque, half woman and half animal. Come forth, my lovely languorous sphinx, and put your head upon my knee, and let me stroke your throat and see your body spotted like the lynx, and let me touch those curving claws of yellow ivory and grasp the tail that like a monstrous asp coils round your heavy velvet paws. And on it goes in a similar vein, and has clearly inspired more than a few other feline poems and musicals and stage plays. Cats, since ancient times, have been deities, and many a person has already pointed out that most of them probably still consider themselves deities. Now this is Constance Lloyd, who married Oscar and became, of course, Constance Wilde, his poor benighted wife, the mother of his 3 children, who gets very little attention, certainly not as much attention as she deserves, for she was a very devoted wife, a very loyal wife. I'm pretty sure she loved Oscar, and if she suspected that he was getting up to anything, she was perhaps one of those wives that bears it with a heavy heart and looks away and says nothing and hopes that the passing fancies pass. And as Joyce Grenfell said in one of her most moving monologues, he still comes home to me. And I think that was what perhaps kept her going. Now, surprisingly, I think Oscar wrote very little about her. She really doesn't feature very much in his works at all. Too wrapped up in other people, particularly pretty boys, and the dreadful Alfred Douglas, to think much about his wife. But he did write one rather short poem entitled To My Wife, really a dedication at the beginning of a book of poems. And there's one other poem which is perhaps not necessarily actually about her, but for the sake of convenience we can pretend it is. But first of all, To My Wife. I can write no stately proem as a prelude to my lay. From a poet to a poem I would dare to say. For if of these fallen petals one to you seems fair, love will waft it till it settles on your hair. And when wind and winter harden all the loveless land, it will whisper of the garden. You will understand. Did he perhaps realise when he wrote that one day there would be a winter, that things would harden and the land would for Oscar become loveless? And did she understand? Did she remember the garden, remember their Eden, when life became unbearable? And she died very young, considering. I think perhaps so. Now, the other poem, which, so far as I know, was not written for Constance, but it's called Her Voice, and it's paired with a poem called My Voice, which I won't read, because we've heard quite a lot of Oscar's voice, naturally enough, in a presentation about Oscar. But we can pretend perhaps that her voice, could be Constance, give her a chance maybe to be heard through all of the other themes and ideas and concepts that we've spun around the words of Oscar Wilde. Her Voice. The wild bee reels from bough to bough, with his furry coat and his gauzy wing, now in a lily cup and now setting a jacinth bell a-swing. In his wandering sit closer, love, it was here I trow I made that vow. Swore that two lives should be like one, as long as the seagull loved the sea, as long as the sunflower sought the sun. I shall be, I said, for eternity, twixt you and me. Dear friend, those times are over and done. Love's web is spun. Look upwards, where the poplar trees sway and sway in the summer air. Here in the valley never a breeze scatters the thistledown. But there great winds blow fair from the mighty murmuring mystical seas, and the wave-lashed leas look upwards where the white gull screams. What does it see that we do not see? Is that a star or the lamp that gleams on some outgoing voyaging argosy? Oh, can it be we have lived our lives in a land of dreams? How sad it seems. Sweet, there is nothing left to say, but this, that love is never lost. Keen winter stabs the breasts of May, whose crimson roses burst his frost. Ships tempest-tossed will find a harbour in some bay, and so we may. And there is nothing left to do, but to kiss once again and part. Nay, there is nothing we should rue. I have my beauty, you your art. Nay, do not start. One world was not enough for two, like me and you. And I think, when all was said and done, that she did love him. And when winter came, and the white-lashed leas and all of the problems set in, and she realised that she was never sufficient for him, that there was always that urge to chase after others, his art that consumed his life, as well as his passion for young men, that nonetheless she had a kindness in her heart for him, a soft spot, a yearning. Now, speaking of pretty young men, on the right there is a painting of Robbie Ross, who is widely believed and argued to probably be his first adult love, putting aside whatever fumblings might have gone on in boarding school. Who knows? That Robbie Ross, himself a man of letters, a man of words, was his lifelong adult friend. They met in their university days and stayed together until the very end as friends. And indeed, after Oscar's death, it's thanks to Robbie Ross that Oscar's poems and plays and prose works and so on were collated and kept when many people were burning them and bookshops were chucking them out, and people, the plays were cancelled, never to be, well, seemingly never to be performed again. Robbie kept the works and preserved them for the day which he hoped, he prayed, he perhaps deep in his heart knew would one day come, when the world would forgive Oscar and once again want to see the plays and read the poems and read the children's stories and read the tale of Dorian Gray and all the rest of it. Robbie was there throughout. But Oscar, whilst he reciprocated the friendship and admired Robbie deeply, his appetites moved on. There were always prettier boys. And then one day he met the dreadful Alfred Lord Douglas, and I fully confess my bias here. I think he was an obnoxious little tit. I really don't see the appeal of him at all. But clearly Oscar did. He fell for him hook, line and sinker. The upper middle class poet falling for the aristocratic youth. He was young, he was pretty, he had pretensions to poetry. He was a bit of a monster, he was petulant. He insisted on getting his own way at each and every turn. And what do you do then? What do you do indeed? Now, throughout this time, possibly before he had met Douglas, but certainly after he met Douglas, because there is the suggestion that it was Douglas, perhaps, who introduced him to the world of rent boys, male prostitutes, and molly houses, which are rather an old and dated term for a gay brothel. Oscar might, of course, have visited those places before meeting Douglas, but Douglas himself was a frequent visitor to such places, frequently hired the services of working class lads. And there's a lot of sort of class subtext going on here of the wealthy making full use of what I suppose to their mind was a bit of rough. Working class lads willing to put out in exchange for money, which isn't to say that none of them perhaps enjoyed it, and I'm sure maybe some of those working class lads were gay themselves, but with any kind of sex work, the clients are basically money, rather than lovers or friends or genuinely desirable people that you want to spend time with. They are first and foremost money, which is not to say that no sex worker ever forms an emotional attachment to a client, and as some people maybe they genuinely do like and possibly even find attractive sometimes, but that's not really the bulk of the work, and there's no point romanticising and pretending otherwise. And I think we should also give some thought to the likelihood that the term boy is not necessarily wholly euphemistic. Some of the sex workers, the lads he would have gone with, would have been probably 15, 16, 17 years old. Legal by the standards of the 1880s, when the age of consent had been lowered quite well. I said obviously not between two men, but the age of consent between a man and a woman had been lowered, so these lads would have, if they were straight or bisexual, would have been legally able to go with a woman, but tacky by modern day standards. And it has been pointed out by various literary critics and historians and what have you, that were Oscar Wilde alive and living in the 21st century, he might have ended up still in the centre of a sex scandal with some kind of #MeToo type thing going on, because of his preference for teenage lads. A bit icky, but there we are. Now this poem is called The Harlot's House. And again, like I mentioned earlier about this sort of verbal or literary tics of certain words that crop up a lot. This poem has a number of them which have cropped up in lots of other poems that Oscar wrote. It's a very rhythmic, very lyrical poem, whilst it appears to be a female harlot's house. It's much more likely to be inspired by his experiences of the molly houses of the male brothels. We caught the tread of dancing feet. We loitered down the moonlit street and stopped beneath the harlot's house. Inside, above the din and fray, we heard the loud musicians play the Treures Liebesherz of Strauss, like strange mechanical grotesques, making fantastic arabesques. The shadows raced across the blind. We watched the ghostly dancers spin to sound of horn and violin, like black leaves wheeling in the wind, like wire-pulled automatons, slim silhouetted skeletons, went sidling through the slow quadrille, They took each other by the hand and danced a stately saraband. Their laughter echoed thin and shrill. Sometimes a clockwork puppet pressed a phantom lover to her breast. Sometimes they seemed to try to sing. Sometimes a horrible marionette came out and smoked its cigarette upon the steps like a live thing. Then, turning to my love, I said, "The dead are dancing with the dead. The dust is whirling with the dust." And she heard the violin and left my side and entered in. Love passed into the house of lust. Then suddenly the tune went false. The dancers wearied of the waltz. The shadows ceased to wheel and whirl, and down the long and silent street the dawn, with silver-sandaled feet, crept like a frightened girl. And it may well be a direct recollection of the first time that Alfred Douglas took Oscar to a brothel and love passed into the house of lust. And he realised that the boy he loved, he adored, he worshipped, he treated almost like some Grecian god upon a pedestal, was really not much more than a dog with two dicks chasing after anything with a nice arse. And suddenly this whole other world opened up. And of course, it's maybe not the most flattering comparison to make between the prostitutes, the sex workers and marionettes. But in a sense, of course, if you are, particularly if you work in a brothel, you are at somebody else's behest, the pimp, the madam, the procurer, who dictates who you have to sleep with and what you have to do with them and how much gets charged and what small percentage of that money you get to keep for yourself, whilst they pocket the rest. You become a marionette, you become a puppet to somebody else's will. First and foremost, the will of the procurer, of the operator of the brothel, but also inevitably the will of your customers, who pay you and tell you what acts they want to perform and how often and where and in what positions and all the rest of it. And if you're within that kind of environment, you don't have a vast amount of choice over the matter. There are some sex workers who do exercise a lot of choice, I know that, but many do not. And so a rather unpleasant experience for all concerned, perhaps, except maybe the customers who can look past and beyond it. That life eventually led him to run afoul of the Marquis of Queensberry, the father of Lord Alfred Douglas, a brutal, vicious, tyrannical man who abused his wives, who abused his sons, who raged and roared. The whole family was really quite bizarre and eccentric and had a long history of violence and alcoholism and suicide and mental instability. The Marquis being just yet another inheritor of that mental instability, and probably Alfred himself also, a deeply unstable young man, swinging between moods. Oscar and Alfred were frequently seen in public together, dined together, engaged with each other quite openly. The Marquis had already suspected that one of his sons, who went on to commit suicide, was having a gay affair with the Prime Minister of the day, and had denounced them both, and now began to suspect, quite realistically in this case, that one of his other sons was also going the same way with Oscar. Probably didn't realise just how many others, in terms of the rent boys, that Alfred Douglas had been with. In February 1895, having made a number of attempts to publicly humiliate and embarrass Oscar all of which failed and were scuppered at the last minute. He stormed into the Albemarle Club, Oscar Wilde's club, and left a somewhat illegible calling card, the exact wording of which has been debated because it's so badly written, but in which he appears to be either accusing Oscar of being a sodomite or pretending to be a sodomite, posing as one. The word looks like posing. Of course, what Oscar Wilde should have done is what Robbie Ross told him to do, which was rip the calling card up, throw it away and forget about it. But because the card had been left with the servants at the club and they'd presumably read it, Wilde took this as an act of libel, not simply a private message to him, but a libel that was read by others, and took the Marquis to court for a trial. The Marquis booked highly expensive barristers who successfully demonstrated that whatever may or may not have been going on between Wilde and Alfred Douglas, there were no end of rent boys and bits of rough who could be shown to have known Oscar Wilde in all sorts of intimate capacities and effectively destroyed the reputation of Oscar Wilde. And by the end of that first trial in April, the judge directed that Wilde himself should be arrested. Not only did he lose the court case against the Marquis, and it was lumbered with gargantuan expenses to pay for the expense of the trial, the costs of the trial, and pay compensation to the Marquis, which financially destroyed Oscar Wilde. But he was also then himself arrested because of the revelations from the various rent boys and charged with gross indecency and a few other charges as well, and went to his second trial where he was the person on trial rather than the person making the accusations. He was staying in the Cadogan Hotel when the arrest was made, and that later inspired Sir John Betjeman, a poet whom I am a great admirer of, to write a poem, a fairly short one, called The Arrest of Oscar Wilde at the Cadogan Hotel. He sipped at a weak hock and seltzer as he gazed at the London skies through the Nottingham lace of the curtain, or was it his bees-winged eyes? To the right and before him Pont Street did tower in her new-built red, as hard as the morning gaslight that shone on his unmade bed. I want some more hock in my seltzer, and Robbie, please give me your hand. Is this the end or beginning? How can I understand? So you've brought me the latest yellow book, and Buchan has got in it now. Approval of what is approved of is as false as a well-kept vow. More hock, Robbie. Where is the seltzer? Dear boy, pull again at the bell. They are all little better than cretins, though this is the Cadogan Hotel. One Astrakhan coat is at Willis's, another's at the Savoy. Do fetch my Morocco portmanteau, and bring them on later, dear boy. A thump and a murmur of voices. Oh, why must they make such a din? As the door of the bedroom swung open, and two plain-clothes policemen came in. Mr. Wilde, we have come for to take you where felons and criminals dwell. We must ask you to leave with us quietly, for this is the Cadogan Hotel. He rose, and he put down the yellow book. He staggered and terrible-eyed. He brushed past the palms on the staircase and was helped to a hansom outside. And from there, lumbered off to be kept on remand during the trial. Revelation after revelation came. Embarrassing works were read and new interpretations put upon his works. A lot of people had been scandalised by the story of Dorian Gray anyway, and now a lot of people reread it and thought whether this was entirely a story about a lascivious young man chasing after every woman in town and heading off to the opium dens and such like things, to wonder whether this was perhaps also an allusion to Wilde's own lascivious chasings, not of pretty young women, but of pretty young men. And so all sorts of new spins and interpretations and understandings were put upon Wilde's poems and plays and books. Many people got rid of their collections of Wilde's works, slung them in the nearest bin. Many bookshops stopped selling his works even before the end of the trial. And by the end of the trial he was found guilty and sentenced to 2 years in prison with hard labour, which for a man who had never done a day's manual labour in his life must have come as a huge shock, as the judge dispensed what was for him the stiffest sentence he could hand out. There is a short poem called The New Remorse, which we could certainly see as fitting in with whether the remorse he experienced at the trial or perhaps earlier bouts of engaging in wild behaviour and then regretting it afterwards, and a little bit like an addict, eventually going back to committing more and more of the behaviour in a compulsive fashion. But the new remorse. The sin was mine. I did not understand. So new is music prisoned in her cave, save where some ebbing desultory wave frets with its restless whirls this meagre strand, and in the withered hollow of this land hath summer dug so deep a grave that hardly can the leaden willow crave one silver blossom from keen winter's hand. But who is this who cometh by the shore? Nay, love, look up and wonder, who is this who cometh in dyed garments from south? It is thy new-found lord, and he shall kiss the yet unravished roses of thy mouth, and I shall weep and worship as before. You could, of course, take the new-found Lord as Christ coming into his life once again and him repenting, or perhaps it's a reference to him deciding to reform his ways and then meeting some new pretty boy with lovely eyes and a nice firm backside and falling once again upon the supposedly unravished roses of thy mouth, and worshipping before the next, and the next, and the next, with that kind of compulsiveness that does something, regrets it, swears off of ever doing it again, and then a fortnight later is back to square one. Perhaps. Now, Wilde was moved between a number of different prisons. The first few prisons he was in were particularly harsh, brutal experiences for him, as they were for absolutely everybody else, of course, with a lot of the governors of those prisons, and not only the governors, but the staff at the prisons, taking a very contemptuous approach to Wilde, seeing him as this dirty old man who had corrupted innocent youth and deserving of every brutal punishment that could be inflicted upon him. Eventually he was transferred to Reading Jail, and I don't want to pretend for 1 minute that Reading Jail was somehow luxurious or anything like that, but the governor of Reading Jail was a little bit more tolerant of Wilde than previous governors had been, and allowed him to have pen and paper so that he could continue writing not only letters to friends and family and so on, but also writing poetry, to being creative. And for Wilde, this was a godsend. This was his mental salvation. Whilst the prison experience and the hard labour and all the rest of it remained just as crippling and soul-destroying as ever before at the previous prisons, at least now he could write, he could create. And one of the things he created is perhaps his most famous work, the Ballad of Reading Gaol. It is quite a long poem, and I have recorded the whole thing previously. It's up on the blog as well as the YouTube page. And I'm not going to read the whole thing now, but I would like to read the first section of the Ballad of Reading Gaol. The poem not only is a commiseration of his own sorrows and griefs in his own life, but it was also inspired by seeing another prisoner who had been a trooper with the Royal Horse Guards executed at the jail. He was hanged. And the shock, the horror of briefly knowing this man. The prisoners were very much separated and kept apart and forced to live very isolated lives. But he'd become aware of this man, and then he'd been hanged. The shock of that, as well as his own miseries, inspired the Ballad of Reading Gaol. He did not wear his scarlet coat, for blood and wine are red, and blood and wine were on his hands when they found him with the dead, the poor dead woman whom he loved and murdered in her bed. He walked among the trial men in a suit of shabby grey. A cricket cap was on his head, and his step seemed light and gay. But I never saw a man who looked so wistfully at the day. I never saw a man who looked with such a wistful eye upon that little tent of blue which prisoners call the sky, and at every drifting cloud that went with sails of silver by. I walked with other souls in pain within another ring, and was wondering if the man had done a great or little thing, when a voice behind me whispered low, "That fella's got to swing." Dear Christ! The very prison walls suddenly seemed to reel, and the sky above my head became like a casque of scorching steel, and though I was a soul in pain, my pain I could not feel. I only knew what hunted thought quickened his step, and why he looked upon the garish day with such a wistful eye. The man had killed the thing he loved, and so he had to die. Yet each man kills the thing he loves. By each let this be heard. Some do it with a bitter look, some with a flattering word. The coward does it with a kiss, the brave man with a sword. Some kill their love when they are young, and some when they are old. Some strangle with the hands of lust, some with the hands of gold. The kindest use a knife, because the dead so soon grow cold. Some love too little, some love too long. Some sell, and others buy. Some do the deed with many tears, and some without a sigh. For each man kills the thing he loves, yet each man does not die. He does not die a death of shame on a day of dark disgrace, nor have a noose about his neck, nor a cloth upon his face, nor drop, feet foremost, through the floor into an empty space. He does not sit with silent men who watch him night and day, who watch him when he tries to weep and when he tries to pray, who watch him lest himself should rob the prison of its prey. He does not wake at dawn to see dread figures throng his room, the shivering chaplain robed in white, the sheriff stern with gloom, and the governor all in shiny black with the yellow face of doom. He does not rise in piteous haste to put on convict clothes, while some coarse-mouthed doctor gloats and notes each new and nerve-twitched pose, fingering a watch whose little ticks are like horrible hammer blows. He does not know that sickening thirst that sands one's throat before the hangman with his gardener's gloves slips through the padded door and binds one with 3 leathern thongs, that the throat may thirst no more. He does not bend his head to hear the burial office read, nor, while the terror of his soul tells him he is not dead, cross his own coffin as he moves into the hideous shed. He does not stare upon the air through a little roof of glass. He does not pray with lips of clay for his agony to pass, nor feel upon his shuddering cheek the kiss of Caiaphas. It is a heartbreaking poem, it has to be said, and enough to turn almost everybody against execution, but not everyone. He also, whilst he was in prison, wrote a long, rather uncoordinated, rather rambling letter, or what is perhaps more likely a set of entries that eventually became a letter, which was sent to Alfred Douglas, his beloved, who had, through his own constant petulance, because it was Douglas's insistence that Wilde sue his own father for libel in the first place, that led to Wilde's downfall. As Robbie Ross pointed out, if it hadn't been for Alfred Douglas going on and on and on at Oscar about making a public display, a court case, a trial of that stupid calling card, then the whole thing probably would have been forgotten about, and probably Oscar would have listened to Robbie and just ripped up the card and moved on. But Douglas had to have his way, and of course Oscar had to give in to him. And whilst he was in prison, he wrote this letter. It was sent to Alfred. A copy of it was kept, but it was sent to Alfred, who never responded. Didn't turn up, didn't visit him, didn't answer the letter, didn't do anything until after Oscar was released at the end of the sentence. And that indifference, that absence, that silence broke Oscar Wilde's heart almost as much as the prison sentence itself. Now, it's a very long and rambling piece, and I don't intend to read the whole thing, be here forever, but I will read 2 paragraphs from it. 2 paragraphs which illustrate some important points worth bearing in mind. De profundis, from the depths. A week later I am transferred here. 3 more months go over and my mother dies. No one knew how deeply I loved her and honoured her. Her death was terrible to me, but I, once a lord of language, have no words in which to express my anguish and my shame. She and my father had bequeathed me a name they had made noble and honoured not merely in literature, art, archaeology and science, but in the public history of my own country. In its evolution as a nation, I had disgraced that name eternally. I had made it a low byword among low people. I had dragged it through the very mire. I had given it to brutes that they might make it brutal, and to fools that they might turn it into a synonym for folly. What I suffered then and still suffer is not for pen to write or paper to record. My wife, always kind and gentle to me, rather than that I should hear the news from indifferent lips, travelled, ill as she was, all the way from Genoa to England, to break to me herself the tidings of so irreparable, so irredeemable a loss. Messages of sympathy reached me from all who had still affection for me. Even people who had not known me personally, hearing that a new sorrow had broken into my life, wrote to ask that some expression of their condolence should be conveyed to me. So his mother died whilst he was in prison, and his wife, and I think this proves the point from earlier, that she still loved him. She still cared very much for him, despite the embarrassment, the shame, the fact that she had had to leave the country and start a new life, had had to change her surname, had had to change the surname of her children so that they could have some hope of a new life away from the constant haunting shame which, as Oscar himself says, became attached to the name of Wilde. She made that long journey from Genoa to break the news to him, to sit with him, to comfort him in his hour of heartbreak and grief at the death of his mother. And it's almost certainly true that that journey contributed to her own demise not so very long afterwards, because, as it says here, she was very ill herself at the time of making that long journey. But it's also, I think, worth noting that there were people who possibly may have shied away from publicly supporting Oscar, in case anyone tarred their name with the same kind of shame that was tarring Oscar, but who were so moved by the death of Lady Wilde that they wrote letters of condolence to Oscar. He wasn't forgotten, despite the theatres that no longer performed his plays, despite the bookshops that now refused to sell his books. Not everyone forgot him. Not everyone had thrown his books and plays and poetry into the nearest dustbin. Some people kept memory of him. And that's worth recollecting, that's worth knowing, that he wasn't gone entirely from the public mind, from the public eye. And the other paragraph from De Profundis I want to read. Religion does not help me. The faith that others give to what is unseen, I give to what one can touch and look at. My gods dwell in temples made with hands, and within the circle of actual experience is my creed made perfect and complete. Too complete, it may be, for like many or all of those who have placed their heaven in this earth, I have found in it not merely the beauty of heaven, but the horror of hell also. When I think about religion at all, I feel as if I would like to found an order for those who cannot believe, the confraternity of the faithless, one might call it, where on an altar on which no taper burned, a priest in whose heart peace had no dwelling might celebrate with unblessed bread in a chalice empty of wine. Everything to be true must become a religion, and agnosticism should have its rituals no less than faith. It has sown its martyrs, it should reap its saints, and praise God daily for having hidden himself from man. But whether it be faith or agnosticism, it must be nothing external to me. Its symbols must be of my own creating. Only that is spiritual which makes its own form. If I may not find its secret within myself, I shall never find it. If I have not got it already, it will never come to me. And I think that, again, is him in a state of spiritual turmoil, of crisis, of moving from being Christian to being agnostic, to not knowing what to believe, to having moments of quasi-paganism, of seeing himself as having created his faith in the physical, in the beauty of the young men he had fallen for, in art, in theatre, in music, in poetry, in the natural world that he loved so much and celebrated so extensively in his poetic works, which are filled with images of plants and flowers and the beauties of nature. And yet again, feeling that for every heavenly vision, there were also the hellish visions he was having in prison of the shame, the guilt, the remorse, the loss and grief for the destruction of his family name, for what had happened to his wife, to his children, for all of the turmoils that had befallen him. All of that weighed heavily upon him and bore him down in so many ways. But there is the legacy of Wilde's redemption, that Robbie Ross had the faith to preserve his poetry, his plays, his children's stories, his novel with Dorian Gray, in the hope that one day Oscar's name would be redeemed, that Oscar's bisexuality, homosexuality, however you want to categorise and label it as being, would be forgiven. Robbie Ross was openly gay, publicly so. He made no great secret of it and managed miraculously, for somebody so brazen, to avoid the fate that befell Oscar. And whilst Oscar Wilde is quite a significant figure, in, not only today but in decades past, for the movements towards gay liberation and the decriminalising of sex between two men, he's going to be lifted up as this almost kind of saintly figure, hence perhaps that almost shrine-like quality going on there with the statue and the flowers on the left-hand picture. I think it's a shame that Robbie Ross is so forgotten, because he took far more risks than Oscar did. Whilst Oscar lived a double life, Robbie Ross lived an open, public, forthright life, and gets very little credit for it these days. I would like to see Robbie Ross gain the credit he deserved for his bravery, for his wish to go back to one of Oscar's quotes that we read earlier from his work on socialism. Robbie Ross really did hold to the proverb, or whatever you want to call it, of be thyself, that maxim. He was himself, he was never less than himself, he hid nothing, and gets very little thanks for it. So both Robbie's faith in Oscar and his faith in the wider public to change its attitudes, to change its views towards love, lust, desire, passion between two men, and of course by extension between two women, bore fruit. It did eventually change, and as we all know, not in every part of the world clearly, but throughout the Western world it has significantly changed. Laws have been changed and altered. We now have in many countries the possibility of same-sex marriage, same-sex adoption for gay couples, lesbian couples to adopt children. A statue in Dublin, the one there on the right, far from the name of Wilde being shamed and humiliated as Oscar talks about it in De Profundis, it's now celebrated. His plays are almost constantly in performance somewhere in the world. His books are sold openly, studied in academic courses. He is a figure of celebration far more widely now than he ever was when he was alive. And so I want to finish with 3 poems, not by Oscar himself, but by other people. Poems about Oscar. The first one is by the dreadful Alfred Douglas, who lived on to be an old man, never seemed to be terribly repentant or terribly honest either, not a pleasant character at all by any of the descriptions given of him, but continued to write poetry and this particular poem, Two Loves, is a very long poem, so I'm only going to read 2 verses from it rather than the whole thing. But in this poem, which was written whilst Oscar was still around, he coins a line which was used in Oscar's trial by the barrister prosecuting him. And a lot of people think that it must have been Oscar who came up with that line, but it wasn't, it was Alfred Douglas. So, Two Loves. I dreamed I stood upon a little hill, and at my feet there lay a ground that seemed like a waste garden, flowering at its will with buds and blossoms. There were pools that dreamed black and unruffled. There were white lilies, a few, and crocuses and violets, purple or pale, snake-like fritillaries scarce seen for the rank grass, and through the green nets blue eyes of shy perienche winked in the sun. I fell a-weeping and I cried, Sweet youth, tell me why, sad and sighing, thou dost rove these pleasant realms. I pray thee speak me sooth, what is thy name? He said, My name is Love. Then straight the first did turn himself to me, and cried, He lieth, for his name is Shame, but I am Love, and I was wont to be alone in this fair garden till he came, unasked by night. I am true love, I fill the hearts of boy and girl with mutual flame. Then, sighing, the other said, Have thy will, I am the love that dare not speak its name. Douglas is clearly very inspired by Oscar's use of nature imagery and beautiful references to plants and flowers, although it's a lot clumsier in Douglas's hands than it ever was in Oscar's. And of course that last line that I read of the love that dare not speak its name has become a euphemism for the love between two men. And this contrast between the two figures, the figure of love, heterosexual love, and the figure of shame, gay love, homosexual love, are the two figures battling it out in Douglas's poem, battling out, you could say, in Oscar's life to an extent as well. And for some parts of the world, still battling out to today. The other poem, also by Douglas, is called The Dead Poet. And it's very clearly a poem written upon waking. Freud would have a field day with this. The Dead Poet. I dreamed of him last night. I saw his face, all radiant and unshadowed of distress, and as of old in music measureless, I heard his golden voice and marked him trace under the common thing the hidden grace, and conjure wonder out of emptiness, till mean things put on beauty like a dress, and all the world was an enchanted place. And then, methought, outside a fast-locked gate, I mourned the loss of unrecorded words, forgotten tales and mysteries half said, wonders that might have been articulate, and voiceless thoughts like murdered singing birds. And so I woke, and knew that he was dead. Which hardly needs explaining. The last poem to finish on, indeed the finish of this recording, is a poem by Florence Earle Coates, which was written in 1912, and it's dedicated to Robbie Ross, and entitled On Rereading the De Profundis of Oscar Wilde. So she's gone back through that, and it's dedicated to Robbie Ross because of the fact that he preserved Wilde's works and was a huge motivating force in getting them back before the reading public once again as time went by. Oscar had been dead 12 years by the time this poem was written, and I think it's not only good to finish on a positive reflection on Oscar, but on a positive note to Robbie and his devoted friendship to Oscar as well. So, to finish, the poem of Florence Earle Coates. He stood alone, despairing and forsaken. Alone he stood in desolation bare. From him avenging powers e'en hope had taken. He looked, and thou wast there. Why hadst thou come? Not profit, no, nor pleasure, nor any faint desire of selfish gain had moved thee, giving of thy heart's pure treasure, to share a culprit's pain. In that dear place, as thou hadst lonely waited, to greet with noble friendship one who came, handcuffed from prison, pointed at and hated, bowed low in mortal shame. No, no thought hadst thou of any special merit. So simple, natural seemed that action fine, which kept alive in a despairing spirit the spark of the divine, and taught a dying soul that love is deathless, even as when its holiest accents fell upon a woman's heart who listened breathless by a Cimmerian well.